everyone, and thank you for joining us for this discussion on early insights into gender impacts of COVID-19. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we meet today, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Linda Ward, and I'm the chair of the ACT Women in Economics Network. Today's discussion is based on the September special edition of the Australian Journal of Labour Economics, which focused on some of the key economic issues arising from the pandemic and explores the associated gender issues, both directly and indirectly, in the labour market. The AGLE is the journal of the Australian Society of Labour Economists and the Centre for Labour Market Research, and the publication is supported by the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre at Curtin University. Anne Daly was the managing editor of this edition, and I'd like to thank her for inspiring this event. I'd also like to acknowledge all of the other contributors to that edition, not all of which we've been able to include today due to the timing of just 1 hour. Now to our panellists. Alison Preston is a professor at UWA, a labour economist and a leading authority on gender equality in Australia. Tania Day is a research economist at South Australian Centre for Economic Studies at the University of Adelaide. Elise Klein is a senior lecturer of public policy at the Crawford School at ANU. And Kay Cook is a professor and the Associate Dean of Research in the School of Social Sciences, Media, Film and Education at Swinburne University. Thanks very much to all of our panellists for joining us today. I'm about to turn to questions to the panellists, but we do hope to have a few minutes for questions at the end, so do feel free to put your comments or questions in the Q&A section. So firstly, Tania, to you. Can you kick us off by outlining some of the key changes in the participation of women in the labour market that you observed as part of your research?
First of all, thank you, Linda, for the opportunity to continue the discussion. Well, when it comes to participation rates for women, I would like to look at the working age population as well as the population with preschool and school-going children. So if we look at the long-term trend estimates from ABS data, we can see that between 1990 and 2018, participation rates for women have increased, whereas that for men have decreased. And the participation gap has decreased from 20+ percentage points in 1990 to about 10 percentage points in 2018. Now, this narrowing gap in gender participation can be attributed to a few factors. First of all, more women joining the labour force as a result of government policies on childcare, parental leave, flexible work arrangements, etc. Then also we can contribute some of the factor to more women delaying having children or opting out of having children to join the labour force, as we can see from declining fertility rates. Also, women are getting more tertiary qualification over time. And another factor would be towards this increase in participation rate for women would be societal change, such as erosion of the male breadwinner status, and also structural changes in the labor market, where we can see a clear shift from manufacturing to services. And finally, one of the reasons is development of labor-saving technology, which is leading to erosion of male-dominated jobs that are more prone to automation. Now, participation rates for women have increased over time, which is a good thing. But if we delve deeper, what we will find is that most of the increase in employment has been in part-time jobs for women as compared to full-time jobs. And if we look at the unemployment rates for women and underemployment rates, we can get some more insights from there. But we find, if we look at the unemployment rate, is that unemployment rate for women who are looking for full-time work is a lot higher than men, and unemployment rate for men who are looking for part-time work is a lot higher than women, which indicates that women are faced with barriers when it comes to full-time work, and men face barriers when it comes to looking for part-time work. And again, if we look at underemployment rate, we find that underemployment rate for women is a lot higher than men. And particularly underemployment rate among women who are looking for part-time work is a lot higher than underemployment rate among men who are looking for part-time work, which only indicates that women who work part-time would like to do more hours, but are unable to do so either due to financial reasons or social norms. Now, turning to the men and women who have preschool or school-going children between 2009-10 and 2019-20, what the data shows is that the participation rates for men have remained pretty much stable, but that for women have increased. Now, and particularly when women with children, women transition from having children who are preschool to school-going, their participation rate increased. So what this indicates is that the policies that were aimed at retaining women in workforce or increasing women's workforce participation have been effective, but there has been limited success with respect to economic and social supports to facilitate gender flexibility for men in combining work and family responsibilities. Now, again, if we look at the underemployment rates for women with preschool and school-going age children, what we see is that underemployment rate for women with preschool age children is 2 times that of men. And for those with school-going children, it is 3 times that of men. So there is certainly scope for improvement in this area. And especially in the context of COVID-19, what we see is that at a high level, research shows that women have been more adversely impacted due to the pandemic. They have lost more hours due to industrial and occupational segregation. In contrast, they spent more time in unpaid housework and caring for children and elderly. So as well as taking on bulk of the homeschooling responsibilities. Thank you, Linda. Over to you.
Thanks, Tania. That's a good high-level context for the rest of the discussion. I'll turn now to you, Alison. Your research focused on superannuation in particular. In response to COVID, there was also a targeted policy allowing early withdrawal of super balances, which I'm sure many people are aware of. But can you talk us through in a bit more detail that change and the likely gendered effect on balances? And you're on mute.
Apologies. Thanks, Linda. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to share a screen with you as well. So I'll just do that right now. So I'm sure we all remember, but once COVID hit, there is a change to the superannuation withdrawal arrangements. There's always been a provision to withdraw some superannuation funds if you're facing financial hardship. But following COVID-19 last year, the government introduced some new temporary changes which significantly relaxed the provisions for making an early withdrawal. So you might remember that individuals could access up to $10,000 in each of 2 financial years, in financial year 2019-20, and then in financial year 2021. To be able to eligible, they could be unemployed, if they've been made redundant, if they'd had their working hours reduced. So the test was not such a high barrier. And according to APRA data, by 31st of January 2021, there had been 4.9 million applications to make a withdrawal. There were 3.5 initial applications up until June financial year in 2020. And then there was another 1.4 repeat applications. And the graph that I've got down here in the bottom shows the distribution of withdrawals. And we can see that, well, you might not necessarily see the proportion straight off, but let me just tell you that 57% of the applications were actually made by male fund members. The balance obviously by females. And what we can see in this part here is that the majority of withdrawals were amongst young people aged 25 to 34, followed by the next 35 to 44, which I'm sure comes as no surprise. This is the group that would be facing particular hardships. And so in terms then of the, let me move to the next slide that I've got here. So in terms of the gendered effects of this, surprisingly, I've actually shown it up here as red, the data. There is surprisingly very little data that enables anyone to really look and see what's happening with superannuation balances. The latest data by the Australian Bureau of Statistics is for financial year 2017-2018, and there's no clear indication of when the next level of data is going to be released. The ABS has actually put up a special publication just recently, looking at the effects of COVID on superannuation balances. And they've got two industries there. They've looked at construction, which is a male-dominated sector, and they've looked at what other sector did they look at? Accommodation and cafe workers. And again, they can see that from those particular data that the constructions have had no particular impact, but the workers in the accommodation and cafe sectors have had an impact. But these are not the main sectors where people are employed. And so this is, it's hard to get a real feel for what's happening because there's not a lot of data there. So the data that we actually used in our paper in the AGLE is from APRA, and APRA's data looks at the average balances of fund members. So it's not necessarily comparable to the ABS data, but just staying with that, the main comparison we were able to make then was looking at the average balances of males and females. We looked at it in June 19 and at June 2020. And June 21 figures won't be released until December of this year. What we were able to see is, although males had a higher incidence of withdrawal, that was what I showed in the last slide, the early data analysis suggests that there's a widening gender gap, and we were able to show that at these average balances, the gender gap had widened by 15 percentage points. So it does suggest that we are going to see a gendered effect of COVID on superannuation balances. Why is that the case? We couldn't really get into that right now with these data, but we do believe that it relates back to the employment disruptions that we've just heard Tania talk about. And it's important to remember that JobKeeper, which was fantastic and a really a sensible initiative for the governments to employ, it covered wages, but it didn't cover superannuation payments. And so it might also be that what we're seeing in these data are these JobKeeper type effects. But I'll stop sharing here, and perhaps we can return to some of that later in the questions. So thank you, Linda.
Thanks, Alison. That also flows quite well into thinking about people on social security payments as well as another kind of support.
Yeah.
So I'll turn to you, Kay. If you could run us through some of the survey that you and Elise undertook in response to the social security payment changes that occurred as a result of the pandemic. Thank you.
Sure, thanks Linda, and thanks for the opportunity to further explain our research. And just before I begin, I'll just like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which Swinburne is located. So just to contextualise to begin with, the base rates of Australia's working age social security payments are below the poverty line, and they have been for some time. And people who receive these payments are often required to undertake various mutual obligations, such as work for the dole. However, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Australian government introduced a $550 a fortnight coronavirus supplement, and it temporarily suspended those mutual obligations of people having to go out and undertake job search and other work activities. So as states and territories were able to control the spread of the virus and ease the restrictions, the government then began to reduce the supplement and reintroduce these mutual obligations. And people receiving these payments, the social security payments, were soon returned to poverty. So in light of those circumstances, Elise and myself and two other researchers who are community service practitioners and members of the Treating Families Fairly Alliance aim to better understand how people who relied on these social security payments during the pandemic experienced this significant increase in their payments and the pause to their mutual obligations. And we also sought to compare whether these experiences differed between people who did and did not receive the supplement, either because their payment didn't include the supplement, so not every Social Security recipient received this additional payment, or because they didn't receive Social Security payments during that time. So to collect people's experiences, we used an online survey, and this began data collection in late October of 2020. And this was just after the government announced that the coronavirus supplement would be reduced by $300 to a rate of $250 per fortnight from the 25th of September. So we were able to ask about the initial high value payments, the reduced payments that were forecast to come in, and then the survey then closed on the 1st of December. So 173 people completed our survey, and of those, 146 received Social Security payments, while 27 did not. And of those 146, 92 received the supplement, and 54 people were on payments that didn't include that supplement. 38 of the respondents had their mutual obligations suspended, and we didn't include a detailed analysis of what happened with those temporary suspensions. But we found that the supplement was really used by people to meet their basic needs, remembering that I said at the beginning that payments were below the poverty line. And they used their payments to improve their household's long-term financial security as well. And it was the supplement and the suspension of mutual obligations improved respondents' physical and mental health, and it contributed to their overall sense of well-being. The changes increased their engagement to the labour market and other forms of activity, and allowed people to better engage in other forms of unpaid productive work, including care work and community support. So these dramatic changes that we observed enabled people to turn their attention away from this day-to-day survival on incomes that were below the poverty line and towards more economically secure futures. And the changes meant that people receiving Social Security payments during this pandemic had a reprieve from the financial stress and scrutiny uncertainty of what it meant to be in receipt of benefits. Our findings indicated that the government's strategy to force people off Social Security as soon as possible by providing a meagre support is harmful to them, and it actually creates barriers to employment and other productive activities. And it's therefore counterproductive to their stated goals. So some of our recommendations were to, first of all, and echoing the last speaker, to strengthen data collection and to facilitate further research on both time use and Social Security. And you could do this by inserting such questions into big data sets so that we can actually measure and assess what's happening, to deliver higher value payments to people, to lift these payments above the poverty line, to replace the mutual obligation system with a system that provides voluntary employment support and more opportunities to find training and career advice that fits with people's needs, and reform the Social Security system so that formal paid employment is not the only form of productivity and work that's recognised. So just to conclude, our research showed that Australia really urgently requires a Social Security system that advances human rights and provides unconditional economic security, which builds people's capabilities and addresses the systemic drivers of disadvantage. And as a nation, we really should be valuing a social safety net as an important institution of a healthy nation. So that's all from me, and back to you, Linda.
Thanks, Kay. And I'll go to Elise, one of your co-authors. And Kay flagged that the pausing of mutual obligation requirements did have some interesting effects on the activity of those recipients. Elise, can I ask you to talk about that in a bit more detail, and also about the learnings for future policy?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks so much for the event, and hi everybody. I also want to acknowledge the unceded lands in which we're all calling in on. I'm on the Ngunnawal country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Look, I mean, yeah, thanks so much, Kay, for giving a great overview of the research. So what we really saw this as and it was the measures at the start of, I guess, the COVID lockdown, as Kay said, that things have dramatically changed since. But in that first lot of measures that the government introduced, they really did something quite out of the ordinary in when you're, so if you're someone that watches Social Security, that they really introduced measures that turned their sort of punitive approach on its head and took away a lot of the conditionalities in which have been a feature for the Australian Social Security for quite some time. Also, they increased some people's payments by this $550 a fortnight supplement. So we really thought of this as a really important moment to study what happens when, you know, there's a natural experiment almost going on that conditionalities are being removed, although the cashless debit card and those kinds of conditionalities continued. And so we were asking people what the suspension of mutual obligations meant. You know, people were reporting some really important, I think, experiences. People were talking about how the suspension of mutual obligation really helped their psychological well-being, and you know, the constant anxiety, the feelings of, you know, the hostility to which the mutual obligations are designed to cause, to sort of compel and activate people into the labour market, are taken away. And this created some really positive feelings for people who felt dignified again. They weren't being hounded, and they were able to have the space and time to think through about how and what they wanted to do to be able to engage with the labour market. An important sort of gender dimension of this is that people in our research also talked about, you know, having experienced domestic violence, how their relationship with Centrelink was like a new violent relationship. The kind of control that they were experiencing was triggered experiences that they had with an abusive partner. So I think that's a really important piece that I think is coming out more and more about the impacts of mutual obligation, and which people talked about in our research. But also, I think what was interesting is that the suspension of mutual obligation freed up people's time, and people talked about that. People talked about, you know, how jumping through hoops and the sort of activation strategies that mutual obligation tries to do creates a lot of unnecessary hurdles to jump through, and wastes people's time. It takes people's time away from doing the things that they know they need to do to get into the labour market. And that was, I guess, the other thing that people talked about, is with their time, they were able to start studying, that they were able to have the space to be able to think through how to engage with the labour market and what is it they actually wanted to do. The third thing that people talked about was how they were able to continue to do other important work that they were already doing. And I think this is a real tension with a lot of, you know, sort of policy discourse about mutual obligation that seems to sort of present people who are taking payments as, you know, unproductive or doing nothing. And there's been all sorts of ways in which that has been stigmatized. And people, you know, in our research are talking a lot about it, how they are already doing really other work that we would understand has been extremely productive: social reproductive labour, care of children, caring of community, self-care. And so people talked about how this extra time helped them be able to do that work better. Which I think is important. And this is backed onto the fact that a lot of people who were interviewing also got the supplement. So the extra money also helped. Say, for example, people talked about not just the time helped, but the money also helped, say, looking after their kids, which they were already doing, but it just made things like, you know, affording food and not having to ration. Of course, the extra supplement helped with that. So just to sort of summarize summarize, I think Kay sort of gave some, important points around what this means for policy. But, it was a small sample, it was qualitative research, so more data, of course, is needed. But I think, these insights and from this research, but there's others that are coming out also, is really contesting this idea that mutual obligation activates people to get into the labour market. That what people in our research are saying is that we're already working, we're already doing and trying and engaging, and also that not everybody can engage in the labour market because they're doing other work such as reproductive work. And so mutual obligations can get in the way of that. And I think that's a really important piece that we need to think about. So in terms of policy, it would be a reorientating away from conditionality and towards a more voluntary and supportive social security system that helps people who are able to get into work and to do so. Thank you.
Thanks, Elise. Tania, I'll go back to you, and you've already given us some sense of the impact of policies on female participation, but if I can ask you to talk about a little bit more about your research and what insights are relevant for policymakers to consider when it comes to encouraging higher female participation in the workforce.
Thanks, Linda. I think the first question that policymakers should ask is, why do we need to increase female labour force participation? Now, the backdrop to any review into increasing women's labour market participation should be the facts that Australia is faced with the problem of population ageing, low fertility rates, and stalled migration due to pandemic. Also, according to the last ABS population projections, which goes up to, I think, 2066, a lower proportion of working age population will be looking after a higher proportion of aged population, which means a narrowing of the tax base. So one way to maintain economic growth and living standards will be to incentivize women for higher participation in the labour market. Research by KPMG shows that Australia's GDP could increase by $60 billion in the next 20 years, and Australia's living standards can be raised by about $140 billion by increasing female workforce participation. Besides, it's not just that. A higher workforce participation from women will empower women financially, which we know women are super poor, and especially under the current pandemic situation, they are much more adversely impacted. But it will lead to long-term as well as short-term gains to governments. Short-term gains in terms of higher tax revenue and long-term gains in terms of less demand for pension and allowances. Now, with that background in mind, there are certain insights that policymakers should consider. First of all, women are highly educated. A higher proportion of women have bachelor degree and above compared to men. Yet, once they have children, they transition from working full-time to part-time or drop out of the labor market altogether. So we lose all this valuable human capital. So what this shows is that having children is a crucial turning point in a woman's life. Caring for children and household is a lot of work, which is necessary and has to be done on a daily basis. How this housework and caring work is distributed among men and women at the beginning of a couple's life and when they have children gets reinforced later on in life. And Hilda data shows that this pattern does not change much even after 10 years of having children. So there are issues here ranging from social, cultural, workplace, financial, etc., which prevents women from participating more in paid jobs. As a result, women end up spending twice the time in unpaid work compared to men, and men end up doing twice the paid work compared to women. Now, another issue that policymakers should consider is that women predominantly work in industries such as healthcare and social assistance, education, etc., and in jobs that are considered as low risk. Yet, these are the jobs that are very hard to automate. They demand social and emotional skills, such as communication and empathy. Also, they do a bulk part of part-time and casual jobs, which again gives them less financial stability and security. Yet, these are the high-demand jobs of the future, and they're expected to grow more and create more demand. Now, the pandemic, what it did was that it revealed the importance of frontline jobs in caring and teaching industry, and the fact that risk is merely defined by the situation that somebody operates in. Yet many of these high demand jobs have low wage structure, which is a big issue. And if you look at the 2016 census data, what we can see is that a high proportion of men earn personal weekly income in higher income ranges, that is $800 and above per week, and a higher proportion of women earn personal weekly income in lower income ranges, that's below $800. Now, another thing that policymakers should consider is going forward, how to encourage men's participation in caring industry, as there will be more jobs created in this sector as population ages further, and also women's participation in STEM and economics. Now, another thing that is it's a very, very important factor is a disincentive created by the interplay of tax and subsidy, childcare subsidy. This does not incentivize women to increase their work days from 3 days a week to 4 or more days. So this is is a very big issue. And finally, I think in the context of COVID-19, when we start thinking about rebuilding and improving our economy, there are a few things that we should consider. Now, investment in infrastructure, we know, creates jobs in construction industry, which is a traditional way of fiscal spending out of recession. Now, nation building projects are essential for a booming economy as we recover from the pandemic. However, jobs in the social sector, where most of the women work, are equally important for a healthy functioning economy and to ensure future human capital. Now, and also because they are the high demand jobs and the jobs of the future. So careful gender analysis needs to be done when we are formulating policies for creating jobs in the construction and manufacturing, which are male-dominated industries, but at the same time, policies that encourage women's participation in these high-demand jobs needs to be considered. Policy levers, I think, needs to be reset in a way such that men get time to step into the household so that they can enjoy spending more time with their family, and also policy levers should be set in such a way that women get time to step out of their household to take part in more paid work, and this is going to lead to greater work-life balance. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Tania. And Alison, I'll go back to you now. We've been experiencing close to 2 years of disrupted work now for many people, with women already experiencing lower superannuation balances before COVID. What more now needs to be done to ensure all women can achieve a comfortable retirement?
Thanks again, Linda, for that question. And again, I've just shared my screen here, and it flows on really quite nicely from the points I think that Tania's been making here. So first of all, I'm just going to draw your attention to this diagram, this chart down here. And what we're looking at is, of those who are in employment, what proportion work full-time and which proportion work part-time. And what we've also got is the change from 1990 to 2019. So this is over 20 years. So in the article that myself and my colleague Elise have done, we kind of touched a little bit on this participation question as well, and we've shown, just as we've heard from Tania, there's been a significant growth in female participation in the labour market over the 20 years. But if we actually look at the pattern of employment participation once they're in employment, once they're in the labour market, obviously we don't have the unemployed here, but if they're in employment, what we can see, there's been, in 20 years, there's been no change in the way that women participate in the labour market. In other words, the modified male breadwinner model is alive and kicking, and that women continue to participate very much at starting we're at 70% here, and then it comes down to around 50%, and then over the life course we're seeing it's going down to around 30%, and that pattern isn't changing, and it's a point that Tania's just been making, so I won't dwell on it. So in terms then of the superannuation balances, I actually think the financial security in retirement is not about occupational superannuation. So occupational superannuation benefits people who work full-time and who work full-time across the life course, and that is not the patterns for women. Women have broken work histories. We have particular broken work histories at early stages in our career, which relates to child care responsibilities. And those really also impact on superannuation balances later on in life because of the compound interest effects. So if we are serious about having financial security in retirement for everyone, and not just those who have participated in paid employment, but if we're going to value the contributions that people make to society and that come from not just being in paid employment, then we really need to redesign the retirement income system. And there's quite a lot of colleagues of the feminist economists that work in this area would be saying what I'm also saying here is that we need to rebalance the retirement system back towards the age pension. So the age pension is pivotal. It plays a vital role in Australia's retirement income system. We talk about retirees as being self-funded. This is those that fund themselves through the occupational superannuation. And, I have worked full time throughout my career and benefited from the fact that my husband has had the main responsibility for our children, and he's a school teacher who's worked part-time. So I have a nice superannuation balance that I'm looking at right now, and increasingly looking at as we go through changes in the higher education system. But anyway, but I have gained from a lot of the tax concessions that are there. So self-funded retirees get a lot of welfare support here. And I think if we're serious about achieving financial security for everybody, we need to rebalance it back to the age pension. And we'll also need to look at how we support beyond the age pension. So the way that housing prices have gone, the way that divorce rates are going, the way that rents are going, the risks that women face in old age because of that means that we need to look at some of the other social security supports as well. So I'll stop sharing my screen here again, but thank you again, Linda, for the opportunity to make some of these points. Thanks.
Thanks, Alison. I'm going to open up to one last question for all panelists, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So if you are listening and have a question, please type it in now and we'll come to you soon. So finally to everyone, and I'll start with you, Kay. What do you think should be the top priority for governments in boosting female participation now as we look towards economic recovery?
Thought I'd click that, but you always have to have one who has their microphone on mute. In the short term, I think low cost or free childcare would be a great incentivizer, that the cost of childcare is quite high. But I think, drawing on what Tania and Alison have just said, this is really a structural problem over the life course, that in the long term, we've had a lot of policies that have sought to de-gender policy across the life course, but we still have this very gendered distribution of working and caring, and a very gendered approach to incomes and how these are distributed across the life course. So we need to, while we have enabled sort of the counter normative model where the earner and the carer are able to switch, there still has to be a primary carer and a high intensity earner, and so that is able to switch. But what we haven't done is make any difference to the equalisation of care. That we haven't, for example, looked at parental leave policies with the Nordic sort of use it or lose it model where fathers are incentivised to care, and we haven't normalised the sharing of care over years, where it's not a block of 6 months at one point in time. It's how can both parents work 3 or 4 days a week to both have equal incomes. And looking at the questions in the chat, this then goes across the life course. If parents separate, women are not left incredibly vulnerable. That at the moment we have a situation where women's financial security really intensifies across the life course if they're not in paid employment, and men's caring insecurity intensifies across the life course, where they're strained, they have minimal care time for children, relationship separation, they end up particularly lonely in older age, that we need to equalize this on both ends of this spectrum.
Thanks, Kay. I'll go to Tania next, and then Elise, and finally Alison. Thanks, Tania.
Thanks, Linda. I agree with a lot of the points that Kay just mentioned, that it's not just one thing, that it's a structural problem, and increasing women's participation in the labor market will need a multi-pronged approach from government, society, as well as workplaces. Now, having said that, government policies can definitely play a key role here, and they can be effective. Now, as we saw in the past in case of the baby bonus, now resetting government policies on parental leave and childcare subsidies can influence how unpaid work is distributed among men and women, and ensure increased participation of women in paid work, because unpaid work, even though, I mean, it can be quantified, but it's just the turning point that decides whether a woman will work or take care of the household. Now, first of all, it's necessary to revamp parental leave to make it more gender equitable, and acknowledging the shift in society from traditional breadwinner type models to more non-traditional gender roles. Now, caring is not exclusively women's work. Men and women can both be carers. And now when men are more inclined towards caring roles, they should be given equal opportunity. Maternity leave has helped many women return to work, but in order to increase labor market participation from women, parental leave should be amended to include the fact that both men and women nowadays spend time, that men want to spend more time with their children and help around the house. Now, how domestic and caring responsibilities are shared around the house at the birth of a child, that gets reinforced and leads to gender distribution of unpaid work, with women, as I mentioned before, women having to take twice the unpaid work and men doing twice the paid work. So it's unfair to both men and women. And this becomes a social norm when women only tend to go back to work part-time or drop out of the labor market. So as Kay was mentioning, there are lessons to be learned from other Nordic countries, and government policies on parental leave can certainly be a very important tool in resetting this redistribution of unpaid work. And secondly, there is a lot of scope of improvement in tax and childcare subsidy, which can incentivize women to participate more in the workforce. Now, these two, the interplay of these two jointly provide disincentive to women to increase their participation in the labor market for more than 3 days. Now, women are considered as individuals for tax purposes, but childcare subsidies are based on household income. Now, since most women are secondary income earners, need for childcare arises when the mother goes out to work. And hence, the decision to increase work days will be based on the out-of-pocket expenses of childcare cost based on the mother's salary, not on the household income. So if working an extra 4th or 5th day means that women's marginal wage after tax and childcare subsidy declines, then as a rational economic agent, she has no incentive to increase her workdays. Now, research by Grattan Institute also shows that higher government investment in childcare gets translated into a higher GDP through higher female workforce participation. Now, due to the pandemic, when many men and women have lost jobs, childcare will be unaffordable for many, yet essential for job search, as well as emotional and mental well-being. Now, if government policies are redesigned in such a way that it is lucrative for women to go out and participate in the workforce, then men and women can negotiate among themselves as to how to redistribute this household work for caring and other unpaid occupations like cleaning, cooking, picking up children, and n number of things that have to be done on a daily basis, and that can be outsourced. There is an opportunity for development of a more structured market for these unpaid occupations, which are usually categorized as low skilled, but which also means more job creation and more economic activity. And government can play an important part here in regulating the rights of workers who work in this low-skilled occupation. Now, I think that every calamity or adverse situation presents an opportunity to reset things. Under the current circumstances, when women's jobs have been more impacted due to the pandemic, and they're also taking on higher share of caring, more social and more policy support needs to be provided for the significant half of the population so that we as a nation can emerge healthy, wealthy, and happy. Thanks, Linda.
I mean, just a few quick points from me. Look, I agree with what people have said, and the ideas around how we can support people and women into the labour market who are able to. But I think there also needs to be a much more greater appreciation for that not everyone can work, and also, as already been outlined by my fellow panelists, that we have a problem with the quality of jobs, so labour force participation, sure, but we also must continually keep thinking about what kind of work and the conditions that people are being put into. But I think my emphasis in our sort of thinking is, one thing I think that the pandemic has really exposed is just how crucial social reproductive labour is. And some of that is paid in the health professions, but a lot of it is unpaid, but it has been fundamental in keeping us together and the economy and the society together, and enduring that as the pandemic has worn on. And I think we have a really major issue about how social reproductive labour is not valued in the way in which productive labour or the sphere of production is. I think this has been an ongoing issue in the economy for a very long time, and I think it has never been really adequately addressed. And so, I think there's some really important points that my colleagues here on the panel have suggested, but I'd also just go to the point of the importance of addressing gendered norms and the ways in which gendered norms relegate that work to women, but largely, but also the ways in which gendered norms undervalue this work altogether and see it as something that we need to sort of get people away from, rather than seeing that it's actually fundamental to our society and our economy. Thanks.
Linda, do you want me to talk? Yeah,
yes,
thank you. So my colleagues, again, thanks everybody for your contributions. There's not much more really for me to add here, because I agree with absolutely everything that's been said there. I went to a really interesting CEDA event just a few weeks ago, and it was featuring the whole move for Thrive by 5, which also plays really into helping labour force participation of women as well. I think the main points that I just want to make, and then leave some more time for the discussion, is, and I think we've already been making them anyway, that it's labour force participation is just one part of it. But if they are to be in employment, then it's addressing something to do. It's addressing the underutilisation rate that Tania talked about earlier on. It's addressing the job qualities that Elise has been talking about. We know that women are increasingly holding multiple jobs, which is, apart from the fact that financially that's disadvantaging them, it's also particularly stressful as well. I think I'd like to see governments focus a bit more, or a lot more attention actually, on younger people as well. I think they really are being left behind in the labour market, and that is our future going forward. And then the main one that I want to just finish it up with is to say that we need not only a participation type strategy and a jobs quality strategy, but we also need to really revisit wages strategy as well. And so I keep getting calls right now from journalists about the labour shortages that we have in Australia, and particularly in Western Australia, because all of our borders are obviously still shut. We've got a huge shortage in the care sector, particularly in the nurses. And yet there's all this literature that shows that women have got quite a high level of wage elasticity. And so, is it a real shortage, or is it to do with our wages policy? And there's really nice research that Tania and our colleagues have done that shows that if we were to increase the wages paid in nursing, for example, then it would actually bring back into the nursing profession a large number of women who have actually got nursing qualifications but have left. So I think we need to look beyond participation and look at not just that, but the jobs quality, but also a wages strategy in this as well. But I'll finish there. Thank you.
Great, thank you all. And we've got time for just a couple of quick questions. There's a few questions there from the audience about a universal basic income, and is that really the answer to a lot of the issues that have been discussed today? I'm not sure who would like to take that question. Elise, I'll pass it to you.
Just quickly, yeah, thanks for the question. Look, I think what we saw from the government in that first lot of measures was a move towards a basic income. It definitely, of course, wasn't universal, but, you know, the reduction of conditionalities, the increase in supplement, the ease in which the eligibility criteria changed also. It was definitely a move towards what people understand as a basic income. I think what we can learn, though, from, and of course, the research that we've looked at definitely sort of speaks to that growing body that says, you know, that a basic income, you know, would be very, very helpful for a lot of people. But the kind of type of basic income, I think, remains a massive question. And I think what we saw with the pandemic is how quickly and easily the government could pull these measures away. I think we've also seen, you know, gender disparity, which we've seen, and we've also seen in terms of growing economic inequalities, and we've seen, you know, the really rich keep getting richer. So I think this question about the type of basic income, I think, really matters. And what we've seen with the pandemic is that just because, you know, you may have measures that keep people's head just above the poverty line, and that's really, really important. We must constantly focus on questions of redistribution to ensure that, you know, that wealth is distributed well across all segments of the population.
Thanks, Elise. Another question which we haven't covered today, but some of you may be able to comment on, is the older cohort of single women who are experiencing increasing housing stress, and whether any of you feel comfortable speaking to the emerging trends and policy considerations on this.
Look, I don't mind jumping in here, Linda. Housing's not quite my area, but there's obviously a lot getting done on it, and there's a lot of commentary happening right now, and we can only just see what's been happening. We all know what's been happening. It's in the media all the time about housing prices. Obviously, the interest rates are going to go up sooner than was expected. Inflation's taken off. That's obviously going to start to see rental prices coming through. I don't have a policy solution to this, but all I can see is it's going to become more and more problematic. And so perhaps going back to the question you asked me earlier on about how do we ensure women's financial security, just as an opportunity for me again to say we need to be looking back at the age pension, but we also really need to be thinking about how else do we support them, what other cost of living pressures are there, and how else, what other means do we support them. It's clearly going to be needed. We are, as Elise has just said, becoming an increasingly unequal society, the haves and the have-nots. And that's not the kind of society that I think most of us in Australia would want to see. And it's starting to run away from us. And I think we need to have good interventions to address that.
Okay, thanks, Alison. I'll go to one last question from the audience, and then I think we'll be out of time. What are the longer term implications for the economic status of women coming out of the pandemic? Tania, is that one you'd like to answer? Yeah,
sure. The longest, now, if we don't provide adequate support to women's participation right now, what's going to happen is that women have already lost a lot of jobs, a lot of hours, and they are also taking part in more unpaid work. Now, if when childcare was made free, then a lot of healthcare workers had the benefit of attending to a lot of frontline work while sending their kids to childcare. I think that arrangement should be sort of reinforced again, so that the backlog that has been created in women's employment can be filled up again, and that will ensure women's financial security going forward as well. But if we retract that support now, then and also going forward, the superannuation needs to be thought. We need to rethink superannuation guarantee scheme for women as well, so that the certain amount of the financial loss which women have suffered now, that doesn't go into the future. So I think these are the few things that should be looked at to ensure women's financial security, social security, and mental well-being going forward.
Okay, thank you, Tania. I might close here then. I want to thank all the panelists for your time and being involved in what's been a really interesting discussion. And I can see from the comments as encourage people, giving people a lot to think about and to consider further. Thank you to everyone who's joined the webinar. It's been a great turnout, and a big thanks also to Di Sutherland, who's been in the background ensuring that everything ran really smoothly today. If you're not already a member of Women in Economics, I would like to encourage you to join. It is free for anyone who's a member of the Economic Society, and we always love to see new members. And over the coming year, I think you'll see a lot more in-person events, assuming that we don't end up back in lockdown. And those are a really great opportunity to connect with other economists and other people working in economics. So thank you very much.